SAY, a leading think tank in Mexico, is hosting the Social Mobility Summit 2016. Some of the world's main experts will come together to discuss and help establish a broad agenda for research and policy making. Follow us via live streaming at socialmobilitysummit.org.
Session 5 is about to begin. I would like to invite the speakers to come to the front. It's Jorge Barragán, Santiago Cueto, Javier Delgado.
Good afternoon. This session is going to be about civil society experiences. I don't want to be a kind of dictatorship with the time, but we are short of time, so I'm going to be a little bit strict in this respect. So I'm going to use this thing to sign out to you when we are when you have 5 minutes to finish. So here we have Javier Delgado, Santiago Cueto, and Jorge Barragán. We're going to start with Santiago Cueto, who works in things related with the education. Then we will move to the presentation of Jorge Barragán, that is related with education and the labor market. And we will finish the presentation with the presentation of Javier Delgado, that works in the labor market. So first, I'm going to introduce Santiago Cueto. Santiago Cueto he's currently research director and senior researcher at GREAT, where he coordinates the Peru component of the international study Young Lives, Niños del Milenio. He's also member of the National Education Council in Peru. He has been member of the technical board of the National Institute of Educational Assessment in Mexico and president of the Peruvian Educational Research Society. His main areas of interest are education and human development, particularly within a poverty context. He has published articles in various academic journals as well as books, and has served as editor for scientific articles in this respect. Then we have Jorge Barragán. He is the International Youth Foundation Countries Director for Mexico, where he leads the foundation youth employability efforts. He has got extensive experience in the design, implementation, and evaluation of the labor market solutions in Mexico and Latin America. In addition, he is an advisor to the Education Commission of the Business Coordinating Council in Mexico. And finally, it's going to be Javier Delgado. He has been Inroads, the Mexico's managing director since 1999. The mission of Inroads is to develop and place talented, undeserved youth in business and industry and prepare them to corporate and community leadership. At this non-profit organization, he has been able to structure and grow a talent development program aimed at university students with leadership potential, commitment, and high academic performance from low socioeconomic background. Its goal is to promote these young students' upward social mobility. Based on their work, education, talent, and leadership, whereon they build a platform which allows them to obtain a successful personal and professional development. Well, without further words, please go ahead, Santiago.
Muchas gracias a Marcelo y al Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias por la generosa y cariñosa invitación y por lo bien que nos han tratado desde que llegamos. I'm involved as was mentioned in the presentation in a longitudinal study called Young Lives, but I was asked to talk not about the results from the research, but about how we use the research in trying to influence policy. Young Lives, called Niños del Milenio in Spanish, as you can see, is a free translation that we used for Peru. It's a longitudinal study. Actually, the aim is not so much about generating good knowledge or good papers. It's more to influence policy. So generating the papers is the means to trying to have this impact on childhood poverty by generating evidence, as mentioned in this slide. So the study has been following around 12,000 children in 4 countries: Ethiopia, India, India is, of course, a very big country, so we concentrate in, originally it was in one state, Andhra Pradesh, but in the past couple of years it has split into two, so we have to follow the cohort, Peru and Vietnam. So the aim was to have a variety of country, of economies, levels of development, cultures in this comparative study. So it's coordinated by the University of Oxford and core-funded by the Department for International Development with the support of several other donors, DFID. So I mentioned this about DFID. I mean, it's only fair to mention it, but also to try to picture this this aim that I was mentioning about that goes beyond just producing papers and seeing if somebody will read them, but trying to use them as leverage. So this is the design of the study. We have two cohorts, as I mentioned. The older cohort was born around 1994. The older cohort was born around 2001. So we started taking these household surveys when they were about 8, the older cohort, and 1, the younger cohort, in 2002. And we have been following them as we speak. We're collecting data in round 5 of the household survey. Now, one of the nice features of Young Lives is that these children were 8, the older cohort in round 1, but the younger cohort was 8 also in round 3, 8 years later. So when we produce reports, this has a lot of impact in policymakers and others. We compare children of these two cohorts at 8 years apart. And in general, if I may say a word, you find improvements in many of the conditions. But of course, there are certain groups in the countries that do not move as expected as the other countries. So the older cohort is smaller than the younger cohort, and we have other methods. Starting in 2007, we started gathering data for a qualitative design. Of course, this is a reduced subsample in each one of the countries. And the topic in general has to do with well-being. So we have the household surveys, we have the community data also in this, we have the qualitative study, and we have sub-studies. We have done one when education, as mentioned in this conference, is so important for the development of children. So we visited them in the schools to see infrastructure, teachers, and so forth, conditions under which they studied. Plus the peers with which they studied. We did that around 2010-11, and now we're going back this 2017 for the younger cohort, which is about to finish basic education in all of the countries. So I hope that gives you an idea of the variety of methods and design of data that we have. I included that first line because yesterday it was mentioned that we need longitudinal studies, but one of the problems is that we have very high levels of attrition. We take that very seriously, and it's about 5% after 4 rounds of household surveys, with variations, of course, between countries, among countries and cohorts. In order to have relevance, we have aligned our research with the MDGs and Education for All goals, which are now defunct, but we are trying to align our work with the SDGs. We have not been mentioned in this conference, but perhaps should be relevant for the final discussion, the Sustainable Development Goals set for 2030. So the main idea, one core message, and inclusive policies, leaving no child behind, are key to creating healthier, more productive and just societies, and to break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. We have 5 themes mentioned there, but the household surveys have a variety of information and background to supporting and lines of work, which have resulted in hundreds of academic papers, but also other types of publications, policy briefs, and blogs, and so forth. So I thought that it would be relevant to speak here about what happens between generating the evidence and generating change in policy. And to do that, we adopted this model of theory of change, which probably you have heard of, which is trying to, again, make specific all the steps that should go in between the generation of evidence and the impact in policies, as it was mentioned earlier in our aims. So we decided to set out the underpinnings, assumptions, and approaches that we were adopting, and being a research study, that would differentiate us from other agencies, perhaps, that would be reflected more in the campaigning type of influence. And we wanted to go through more, again, research. So to allow an organization to set out the change that ought to happen and its role within that, and the role of other agencies, complemented, theory of change is complemented by other plans and reporting, and we decided to build on what we had done. So these are the tasks: generate high quality longitudinal evidence, disseminate the evidence in accessible ways depending on the audiences and stakeholders that we wanted to influence, look to be used in improvement of policies of governments and other organizations, and do advocacy. I mean, again, you have several, you could just disseminate the information, would be one level, or you could do very heavy campaigning, which I guess would be more on the other extreme, and we go sort of in the middle and call this advocacy to generate political will and shape policy agendas, accountability, and good governance within governmental systems, adherence to human rights, the Convention of Children's Rights, for example, from UNESCO, plus others that have been published, and positive resource allocation by ministries, donors, and international organizations, and community change. I think I'm going to skip this one, just to mention that here, it's the publication. It's a very short publication that you can see, but you can download if you put Theory of Change, Young Lives. I'm sure you can find it, or if you go into our publication website, you can find it. But I'd rather show you, and this is, of course, not very friendly, but don't go into the details of what's in the cells. I'm gonna outline the main elements of the theory of change. So you have the challenge. The challenge here is reducing child poverty and inequality. And in the other extreme, you have the impact. You have policies and programs to support poor children and young people in developing countries. So again, the theory of change is trying to outline how do you go from the challenge to the impact. And we decided we had to analyze several dimensions. And this is, of course, at the international level, and there's similar level within each of the countries. So you have to understand the context, the stakeholders that are interested in this, the barriers to tackling child poverty. This was brought on by Anna in the previous presentation, and look for opportunity to change. And so based on this analysis, what is it that we do? We think about the building capacity, which is blue here. We think about generating research, of course. We think about ways of optimizing the uptake, and finally think about ways to innovate in the research and the policy methods that we used. And for each one of these, you have the inputs, meetings and publications and so forth, depending on what you have in here, the outputs, which are the products from these inputs, and the outcomes, which are the results, all of which should lead into the impact. I mean, I don't want to go into the detail, and this is probably too general, but again, if you're interested, you can look into the publication. I hope this gives you a flavor of what we do. So here's the difficult question, of course. Does this all make a difference? Does it mean something to somebody? Has it resulted in any policy changes or laws or programs or whatever? And of course, it's easier to measure inputs and outputs than outcomes and impacts. And sometimes I get asked if this law or this program, is it brought about by something that Young Life said? And I said, maybe. I had conversations. I went with them. They said it was important. I think they included some of the conversations, and We haven't have some nice quotes from people saying that this was meaningful, or they can reference some of our findings in the law publications or programs. But of course, generations of programs or assignment of budgets come from a variety of sources. So we sort of say that we want to be in the discussion table and be considered among the other stakeholders, providing evidence and supporting in ways that we can. But we need, to measure this, have we made a difference? We need a better conceptual model and methodologies to measure impact of research on policies. It would be difficult to do a randomized controlled trial or any of the other more accepted methods for establishing cause and effect links, of course. But I have some examples, and these have been published in our booklet that you can find on our webpage. For example, in Ethiopia, the researcher there started meeting with the officers from the Ministry of Women, Children, and Youth Affairs, and they started discussing results, and they got so engaged into that they ended up creating a child research and policy forum that meets monthly to discuss results from young lives and other stakeholders and see how they can illuminate some of the policies or some of the work that they're doing. In second place, UNICEF, the Innocenti office in Italy, that many of you probably know, they became very interested in our work in violence, and we had a module on violence in the household survey, but we also had qualitative work that would be meaningful for this line of work. So we engaged with them and produced several outputs that are going to be published simultaneously. I think some of them have already been published on the importance of violence, how to prevent it, and so forth. No? Juntos. Juntos is a conditional cash transfer program. Of course, this type of program was born in Mexico. And the reason I want to bring it up is because we developed several studies, again, quantitative and qualitative, about Juntos. So whenever I think if you want to influence policy, probably the more direct way is to do something about a specific program that the government is interested in and do it in collaboration with them. And the second thing is to produce several reports. So in their minds, I would think we have become important stakeholders or people to go to in order to discuss what is it that they should do next in the programs. Now, of course, in Peru, as in many other countries, sometimes the problem is that you build a relationship with a public officer, and then for any reason the public officer is no longer in office and you have to start the relationship again, but this is something we work on. And more on the research side, finally, we have publicly archived data set that it's been downloaded freely. The surveys and the databases by close to 1,500 people now. This is from a few weeks ago. And I work in education, so I wanted to mention a few examples of things that may have made a difference or making a difference that are very dear to my heart. Oxfam has used a book that was describing the lives of children in the 4 countries called Changing Lives in a Changing World, and developed a book for children ages 9 to 12 called Everyone Counts. And it's a book on mathematics, as you can guess, and it has all kinds of stories and indications for teachers on how to use it, and I'm going to show you an example in a minute. And we also have every month, I see that there's particularly one in Peru, study that gets downloaded by the hundreds, and I'm sure somebody's using it at a university, and we know the number of downloads, but we're not sure who's using it or how is using it. That's one of the things I want to figure out, because my aim is that some of the teachers at the universities will use these materials with their students so that the next generation of policymakers will become more friendly with the usage of evidence. So this is from the Everyone Counts book. I think Julio mentioned yesterday that we need to put a face sometimes to some of these stories. So I mean, very briefly, but I don't know if I have 3 slides. I don't know if I'm going to read them all. But my name is Seblay. I think that I am 12 years old, but I am not quite sure. I live with my family in a village in a rural area of Oromia State in Ethiopia. I started going to school when I was 8 years old. I still go to school, but I'm behind for my age. My own health hasn't been good. I had tuberculosis when I was 6, and I'm still not completely better. I have also had malaria twice. If I am able to go to secondary schools, I will have to go and live with my grandmother in the nearest town. My older sister has already done this. But it's not about all of hardship. For example, and here's a face, I usually work 2 or 3 days a week after school, depending on where work is available. For this, I earn 6 birr. Sometimes I also sell bread to earn money for my family. I help on the family farm as well, grinding corn for bread and weeding teff. So what is teff? It's part of the homework for children. I would like to be a teacher when I am older. I don't want to get married young, but I believe that my parents may insist that I do. I would like to wait until I am 19. So children have expectations. Children live in specific contexts. They want something. Their parents might want something else. And I hope that by reading this and working mathematics based on this, these children in several parts of the world, ages 9 to 12, will learn not only mathematics, but empathy and citizenship and other skills. So what does it all add up to? Because the official end of this first round of Young Lives is going to end in 2018. And so DFID is saying we need some kind of synthesis and summary reports of how does it all add up to, or what does it all add up to. We have produced summary country reports describing main trends after every round. We have one pending, which is going to be published next year. And we're preparing now synthesis reports for each country and thematic cross-country reports in education, which is almost ready, educational trajectories, impact of preschool, school effectiveness, adolescence, and tracing the consequences of poverty and inequality for children. And of course, I mean, it has been mentioned several times here, so I thought I would put in one more line, because the need for good databases that start at a young age and continue with children into adulthood. So we're going to finish with the younger cohort. The span is going to be from 1 to 15, and the older from 8 to 22. So we would love to continue that. And we also have, of course, a number of children of Young Lives now. Their offspring that we have some data on, but we would love to continue to explore things about intergenerational mobility as discussed here. So, of course, this is all part of a communication team. I'm not a communications person. I'm a researcher working in education mostly. So there's the web page. You find the methods, data sets, publication, profiles, photo, the newsletter you can subscribe to if you feel more friendly with Spanish. Of course, you can visit our website, Facebook, and Twitter. So thank you very much.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias a Dr. Cárdenas, a Marcelo por la invitación a compartir con ustedes el día de hoy el trabajo de la International Youth Foundation. Es un privilegio para nosotros tener esta posibilidad de compartir con ustedes el trabajo que hacemos todos los días y que nos apasiona muchísimo. Particularmente quiero platicar con ustedes sobre la forma en la que nosotros enfrentamos el reto de recibir dinero de donantes corporativos, públicos y multinacionales para poder intentar cumplir dos objetivos. Fundamentalmente el tema de cómo promover la pertinencia educativa del sistema de desarrollo de habilidades vocacionales en México, y al mismo tiempo cómo identificar cuellos de botella y barreras que impiden a los jóvenes de estos servicios educativos acceder a un mejor empleo, ¿verdad? Les quiero comentar que International Youth Foundation es un jugador global que tiene unos 25 años en el mercado, ha tenido operaciones en en cerca de 100 países y ha sido una historia muy interesante de aprendizaje a lo largo de estos 25 años, que a principios de los 90, cuando comenzamos a trabajar, particularmente en África subsahariana, nos preocupaba toda la agenda de juventudes. Nos preocupaban temas de salud sexual y reproductiva, temas de nutrición, temas de empleo, temas de educación, y nos fuimos dando con el tiempo cuenta que el papel de una organización como la nuestra puede ser mucho más significativo en la medida en la que ayudemos a los sistemas educativos a que los jóvenes que egresan tengan un empleo en la formalidad y con un buen salario, ¿verdad? Con seguridad social. Y esto pues resolvía de forma indirecta los otros problemas que tenían esas poblaciones. Y así fue que nos fuimos especializando en el tema de empleo juvenil, ¿verdad? Un poco de contexto. México, dice el índice de complejidad económica, que tiene la 20ª economía más compleja del mundo, ¿verdad? Y esto hace que nos hayamos convertido en los últimos años en la 12ª nación que más exporta, ¿verdad? Particularmente estas cifras suelen contrastar con el tema de la distribución del ingreso per cápita, en donde tenemos la posición número 65 del mundo, ¿verdad? Entonces, un sistema complejo, muy exportador y competitivo internacionalmente, tiene dificultades de distribución del ingreso importantes. Y también estas condiciones de contexto son relevantes cuando se analiza la transición demográfica del país. Aquí pongo dos ejemplos de dos países que representan quizás la transformación de la transición demográfica de México en los últimos 30 años, ¿verdad? Aquí en la siguiente tenemos ya la forma de esta pirámide para el 2010, ¿verdad? Cuando se parece ya mucho más a lo que Corea tenía en los años 80, y esto representa pues una serie de desafíos y de contextos muy particulares cuando enmarcamos las conversaciones que tienen que ver con el tránsito desde el sistema educativo, particularmente en los servicios de formación de carácter terminal, ¿verdad?, con un contexto laboral particular. Y una gráfica que me llama mucho la atención y me ayuda a explicar un poco la aspiración de lo que pienso que el sistema de habilidades, de desarrollo de habilidades vocacionales, debería hacer mejor en muchos países de la región, particularmente en México, es, de alguna forma, es mantener como uno de sus principales objetivos los objetivos de desarrollo económico, ¿verdad? Esto que parece una obviedad, parece muy difícil de encontrar en la práctica, y pareciera que no importa qué sofisticados sean los procesos al interior de una empresa que hace bienes y servicios, ¿verdad? La forma en la que el sistema de desarrollo de habilidades se organiza es para atender toda la complejidad o no de esas labores que se desempeñan en el contexto laboral. Y esto es importante porque en el caso de Corea, cuando desarrollaron su industria pesada por allá de los años 70, ¿verdad?, la forma en la que tenía la población ocupada era muy cercana a la de un triángulo, ¿verdad? Y después, cuando se consolidaron como una economía de mucho valor agregado, ese triángulo no se invirtió, sino se convirtió en un pentágono, en donde el mayor crecimiento estuvo precisamente en el segmento técnico. Claramente el problema es que en América Latina la formación técnica, particularmente lo que se conoce como el Upper Secondary Technical, en este servicio tiene muy mala prensa, ¿verdad? Tiene un sentido de formación residual. Las familias no asocian un sentido de éxito al llevar a sus hijos a esas escuelas, y las empresas tampoco lo consideran en sus planes de reclutamiento y selección. Ahora, yendo un poco más a profundidad, México tiene quizás el único sistema educativo de la región que está basado explícitamente en competencias, y ha resuelto en los últimos años desafíos importantes en materia de cobertura, particularmente del nivel medio superior. Sin embargo, los desafíos de la transición demográfica siguen presentes y otros temas asociados a la calidad y a la pertinencia. Del otro lado, también en la región contamos con empresas que con mucha frecuencia dicen que tienen dificultades para encontrar talento, ¿verdad? Hay estudios recientes como el que hizo McKinsey en 2012, propio Manpower, y recientemente un think tank mexicano llamado CIDAC, en donde hay una cifra que me llama la atención que dice que el 25% de las vacantes en el país, ¿verdad?, no se utilizan, no se coloca nadie en ellas y tienden a desaparecer o a dividirse en funciones más pequeñas y absorberse en la organización. Cuando nos preguntamos cuál es el retorno de la inversión de una familia que debe acudir a los servicios educativos del nivel medio superior técnico en el país, el retorno de la inversión es relativamente bajo, ¿verdad? Las encuestas de seguimiento a los egresados de estos niveles dicen que en promedio ganan mensualmente cerca de $200, ¿verdad? Y estudios específicos para algunos de estos servicios educativos los pone poquito por encima de esos $200, perdón. ¿Y cómo es el contexto del hogar que tiene que acudir a estos servicios educativos? Pues el hogar completo tiene un ingreso muy cercano a los $250, ¿verdad? Y el 60% de papá y mamá no terminó la educación media superior. Y por la forma en la que acceden los estudiantes del nivel básico al nivel medio superior, que es a través de un examen general de desempeño académico que tiene 120 reactivos, ¿verdad? Aquellos con mejores desempeños eligen como primera alternativa escuelas públicas, preparatorias públicas, que dependen de las universidades nacionales, ¿verdad? Los que no les va tan bien acuden a preparatorias públicas también de universidades autónomas regionales. Pero aquellos, ¿verdad?, que tienen menores logros académicos en el nivel básico, ¿verdad?, tienen que acudir a la formación técnica, ¿verdad? Y entonces el sistema tiene la necesidad de atenderlos, siendo los segmentos más vulnerables y con menores desempeños por el riesgo de selección. Y lo que nos hemos dado cuenta es que independientemente cuál sea la medida de retorno, esos poco más de $200 de los salarios que reciben al egresar de estos servicios educativos, si lo sumamos con el ingreso familiar, ¿verdad?, no superamos la línea de bienestar. Ajá. Y eso es quizás el razonamiento principal que está detrás de la teoría de cambio de las inversiones que realiza la Fundación en México. Queremos engancharnos en estas intervenciones en donde podemos modificar este resultado para que los jóvenes aspiren a empleos con mayor ingreso y con seguridad social, lo cual implica que es una familia que aspira a clase media. ¿Y cómo lo hacemos? Esta gráfica es muy interesante porque hemos iniciado a estudiar el mercado laboral a partir de sus vacantes y la Fundación tiene una base de datos de 10 millones de vacantes que se han publicado en los últimos 3 años. Esta gráfica es para las vacantes del segmento técnico del estado de Nuevo León, uno muy industrial al norte del país, solamente del segmento técnico. Y fíjense cómo la línea azul, que es la línea del salario ofrecido, tiene una variación enorme, ¿verdad? Aquellas que pagan más son las vacantes que están alineadas con programas vocacionales industriales, a diferencia de las vacantes que pagan menos, que están alineadas con programas vocacionales de carácter más administrativo o inespecífico. Y entonces aquella área de color gris que señalo en la gráfica es la que informa nuestra agenda de pertinencia curricular. ¿Cómo hacer que las habilidades que están demandando esos empleadores que están dispuestos a pagar mayores salarios y seguridad social están de alguna manera enfatizadas o incorporadas en el currículo? Y a esto le llamamos un poco el tema de atender el desfase o el desempate de habilidades. Para lograrlo necesitamos establecer una conversación significativa entre las escuelas y las empresas. pero uno de los problemas más grandes es que al parecer las escuelas son de Marte y las empresas son de Venus, ¿verdad? No hay una conversación significativa o fluida, ni siquiera un lenguaje común. Las empresas piensan en producir bienes y servicios de forma competitiva, para lo cual necesitan que su personal desarrolle rutinas, que se desarrollen a partir de ciertas habilidades, y esas habilidades están codificadas en las descripciones de puestos y en sus presupuestos de capacitación. Y este lenguaje es completamente ajeno a incluso los sistemas de desarrollo de habilidades en el contexto de América Latina, en muchas ocasiones, que piensan en objetivos de aprendizaje, ¿verdad? Que están codificados en unidades de aprendizaje, en materias, en programas en particular. Y la conversación, según nuestra experiencia, se da a un nivel bastante superficial. Cuando nosotros logramos en un mercado regional particular profundizar en la conversación para identificar cuáles son las habilidades críticas que requieren las empresas, ¿verdad? Como sector, vamos a buscarlas dentro del currículo y verificamos si están, qué está pasando y por qué las empresas en sus esfuerzos de reclutamiento no las identifican en los jóvenes que están egresando de ese servicio educativo. Y cuando hay autonomía curricular, que es un tema importante cuando entendemos el sistema educativo en México, en donde hay un currículo nacional, ¿verdad? Y hay poca autonomía curricular en algunos de los sistemas públicos, hemos sido capaces hasta de incorporar nuevos objetivos de aprendizaje de la mano de la industria. Y esto en particular hace que haya una nueva conversación, ¿verdad? Que tradicionalmente las escuelas en su condición iban a tocar la puerta de las empresas y les decían, oye, con quizás una conversación sumamente filantrópica, ayúdame con becas para los estudiantes, ¿verdad? Así empezaba el foco de la conversación. Y cuando logramos tener una conversación basada en la brecha de habilidades, la forma en la que se involucran en esta nueva conversación es, oye, ¿cómo ayudo en tu estrategia de reclutamiento y selección? Y esto ha hecho que podamos lograr avanzar de forma significativa. Aprovechando los minutos que me restan, les voy a platicar un caso en particular, que fue una intervención que hicimos en el estado de Chihuahua con el sector de ensamble aeroespacial. Hace 10 años no existía este sector en el estado de Chihuahua. Es relativamente reciente y ahora es responsable de 2 de cada 3 empleos de la industria en el país. Tienen un clúster, ¿verdad?, de 45 empresas muy importantes que, muchas gracias, que están teniendo una conversación con el sistema educativo. Y la primera premisa de esta conversación fue cuáles eran las habilidades críticas que requerían y que veían escasas en ese mercado en particular. Y es una característica del ensamble aeronáutico que está sumamente certificado, que las empresas prácticamente dentro de la bolsa del saco tenían ya la lista medida, priorizada, ¿verdad? Y en una agenda de transformación. Y con esa información, ¿verdad?, fuimos a buscar esas habilidades al currículo. Y lo primero que nos dimos cuenta, primero expresarlas en una curva de demanda, ¿verdad?, en términos de un plan de ampliación de los próximos 10 años por temas de crecimiento y rotación. Y a partir de ahí fuimos a analizar los programas específicos de las escuelas para verificar hasta qué punto abordaban las habilidades críticas, ¿verdad?, que requería la industria. Y nos dimos cuenta de que en promedio un programa que mide 3.500 horas en 36 meses, apenas el que mejor posición tenía, reservaba unas 700 horas, ¿verdad?, para estas habilidades críticas. A partir de ahí juntamos cifras de egreso contra demanda en un mercado dado y nos pusimos a trabajar de manera conjunta, intentando hacer medidas de corto, de mediano y largo plazo para que las habilidades que sí estaban dentro del currículo se enfatizaran con capacitación docente, con nuevos materiales, y las que no estaban se pudieran incorporar. Y aquí volteamos un poco a ver cómo se estructuraba la cadena de suministro. En Chihuahua hay empresas que venden productos ¿verdad?, a empresas que están en Estados Unidos, en el área de Spokane, en Washington, cerca de la planta de Boeing. Y lo que pudimos hacer es comparar, ¿verdad?, los resultados y los desafíos en términos de habilidades, y movilizamos currículo desarrollado por Boeing para incorporarlo en escuelas públicas en el caso de México, y entonces ya tener una hoja de ruta, ¿verdad?, para poder minimizar la curva cuantitativa y cualitativa de habilidades en este mercado. ¿Cuáles son los resultados que tenemos a la fecha? Acaba de graduar la primera clase que intervenimos hace 18 meses, y el 33% de los jóvenes, 4 meses después de graduar, ya cuentan con un empleo en empresas del sector aeronáutico, que pagan 35% más que el promedio, ¿verdad? Y todas ellas dan seguridad social. Y estas empresas, antes de esta conversación, no tenían una relación estrecha con los colegios que estamos haciendo. Esperamos que estas cifras, a los 6 meses, que es el estándar para el seguimiento de la empleabilidad de un servicio educativo, se muevan hacia el 60%. Ahora, ¿qué lecciones hemos aprendido? Y son mis últimas 2 diapositivas con las que intento envolver el mensaje. El tema de la colaboración entre escuelas y empresas es un problema de acción colectiva. No es sencillo, ¿verdad? No es sencillo trabajar colaborativamente. Al interior de las organizaciones es difícil. El área de programas y el área de finanzas suelen no tener los mismos incentivos. ¿Por qué lo tendría una escuela pública, verdad?, contra un grupo industrial? Y hemos aprendido que el papel de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, apoyando estas conversaciones como backbone organizations, ¿verdad?, tiende a hacer que la conversación sea más rápida y más consistente, ¿no? Otra cosa importante es que una vez que hay una colaboración y una fluida, ¿verdad?, basada en el tema de la brecha de habilidades, la transición al mercado de trabajo pues suele ser mucho más fluida. Y déjenme, aprovechando que queda un minuto, les diría otra cosa. Hemos avanzado mucho más rápido cuando no pensamos en un mercado aislado, sino en una cadena de suministro. Lo más probable es que ya haya currículo desarrollado en otra parte del mundo que se pueda incorporar rápidamente al contexto mexicano. Y así hemos al menos movilizado 2 importantes a partir de inversiones públicas en el caso de Estados Unidos, nuestro principal socio comercial, para traer currículo que fue recientemente actualizado. Otra lección que hemos aprendido es que las empresas quieren trajes a la medida y las escuelas no se pueden dar el lujo de hacer eso, ¿verdad? Y tienen que tener aproximaciones para habilidades mucho más transferibles. En algún momento hay que encontrar el equilibrio para que haya una aproximación ganar-ganar, ¿no? Y aquí hay uno de los instrumentos que utilizamos, precisamente desarrollado por el Departamento del Trabajo de Estados Unidos, que es una pirámide de competencias. Y a partir de ahí vamos de lo más general, la parte de las habilidades socioemocionales, hacia las habilidades más específicas que se relacionan con el puesto de trabajo, y a partir de ahí dividimos quién debe de hacer qué, ¿verdad? Finalmente, las escuelas deben de, lo que hemos aprendido es que batallan muchísimo las escuelas para considerarse parte de una cadena de suministro de talento, ¿verdad?, que es responsable de proveer un poco las habilidades que se requieren en el mercado de trabajo. Finalmente, en el caso de México, hemos encontrado que a nivel de la escuela hay muchas ventanas de oportunidad. Necesitamos tener directivos que puedan hacer análisis curricular, que puedan leer el mercado de trabajo, que puedan ir a buscar información que se traduzca en datos que apoyen la decisión vocacional de los jóvenes, ¿verdad? Generalmente tenemos problemas de mismatch cuantitativo y cualitativo al mismo tiempo, ¿verdad? De los 2 millones de chicos que están en las escuelas vocacionales en México, el 60% están matriculados en programas de carácter administrativo, que pagan menos, ¿verdad? Y que compiten con los chicos que egresan de los servicios no vocacionales. Y por tanto, los salarios son relativamente bajos, ¿verdad? Otra cosa que hemos aprendido en el caso de México es que necesitamos madurar más la necesidad, particularmente con las instancias de promoción económica, de que es necesaria una visión de desarrollo de la fuerza laboral desde la escuela, y existen muchos retos todavía del lado de las escuelas para incorporar estas medidas de actualización curricular e implementación del currículo con relativos estándares de calidad, ¿verdad? Hay también un vacío, a nuestro parecer, en la política de capacitación del sistema vocacional en México, que no está buscando de manera explícita metas de pertinencia curricular. Y eso es todo lo que les quiero compartir. Muchas gracias por la oportunidad.
Well, thank you very much to the Centro de Estudios Espinosa Iglesias for giving me the chance to present what we're doing and present inroads to such important audience. I come from the battlefield. I'm actually a soldier in the battlefield, so there's something that perhaps I don't know, you'll see them as too basic, but this is what we do. We are a non-profit, not-for-profit organization with a mission of generating sustainable upward social mobility through a leadership development program implemented in partnership with companies focused on high potential university students coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And we were founded in Chicago in 1970. Inroads was founded in Chicago in 1970. And in Mexico we've been for 20 years now. We're a socially responsible initiative. Since we promote upward social mobility, we provide an alternative to poverty and inequality. We facilitate diversity and social inclusion initiatives within the corporate sector, and specifically we generate opportunities towards a professional development which allows young low-income university students to take their future in their own hands. Why we do this? Well, I think this has been the subject of all this summit because of the inequality and lack of opportunities, specifically in Mexico, and because as a nation we need to invest in young, diverse talent. And here's some information of studies that have been made by the OECD and some other institutions. The wealthiest 10% of the population in Mexico has an average income 30 times larger than the 10% poorest. 25% of the population between 15 and 29 years of age neither work nor go to school in Mexico. That's more than 7 million. And according to the OECD, in February 2016, Mexico's youth unemployment rate was double the average national unemployment rate. And this has been the case for many years now, at least 10 years, and perhaps more than that. There's the CDAC study that it was already mentioned. 70.5% of candidates are rejected because of their lack of competencies or knowledge needed on the job. And that's where we want to have impact in this program. How we do it? First of all, by identifying early high potential talent from low socioeconomic background, selection and matching of interns based on the needs of corporate partners, and having a corporate sponsored part-time internships for 1 year aimed at providing meaningful practical experience for these students, enhanced by Inroads training, community service and development workshops. and year-round coaching, follow-up, and personal support to further ensure career success of our beneficiaries. These are the commitments of the three actors of this program: inroads, the companies, and the interns. And of course, there's a fourth actor, which is universities, because we're aimed at university students. Inroads commits to recruit and select beneficiaries aligned to the program with the highest possible success expectations. We provide follow-up to the process. We provide leadership development and training for the students, and we give support and coaching for them. Companies provide practical and meaningful experience. They commit to support and give mentoring to the students in their job, and provide salary for them and finance the project also. So this is not an easy sale for us to the companies, because they have to give the opportunity to the student, give them a salary, and fund the project. And interns commit themselves to maintain high academic performance, drive and commitment to achieve success at the sponsoring company, and participate at the inroads activities, which are the training, the follow-up, and all that I already mentioned. This is a teamwork where youth's talent, work, and commitment combined with their education at the university and the experience at the corporate partners facilities, catalyzed by inroads, training, and all the mentoring and follow-up we provide, bring the results. Which are, well, these are some of our results. Since 1996, more than 1,500 students have been direct beneficiaries of the program, and the average income, just to give you an idea, the average income of the enrollers in 2015 was $611, and that's using the exchange rate of 2015. And just entering the program and the salary they receive from the companies increases that income for by more than 50%. More than 80% of our alumni get permanent positions at their sponsoring companies upon graduation. Last year was 91%, and the previous year was 87%. And this is a statistic from 1996 till this year. Many enrollees from the first years of the program now have leadership corporate positions in Mexico and abroad, and there's many success stories. You can see testimonies in our webpage, and some of them are in the process of achieving this high ranking positions, and as you may guess, the program started with 35. The program started in 1996 with 20 students in 12 companies, and right now we are developing more than 200 students a year, and we hope to keep this growth at this rate. So the larger number come from the more recent years, so they are kind of like middle level positions in the companies. But we have this. We made a survey recently, and 20% of our alumni have a monthly income above $2,000, which is more than triple their original family income. And this $2,000 is already using the actual exchange rate, which is about 20 pesos per dollar. The benefits, well, the benefits I think are obvious. First, the students get the opportunity to develop their skills and talents to acquire a competitive advantage, which actually will help them get that upward social mobility. This is also a win for the company because they they form a talent pool for the future, participating on a socially responsible or socially responsibility project oriented to inclusion and diversity, which is important for some of the companies, especially the larger ones. And universities obtain successful alumni, which contribute as evidence of the quality of education provided by public schools in the country. As you know, in Mexico, coming from a private sector or private school, it gives you a higher status. Some companies just hire people from, or students or alumni from private schools, and some of the public schools are not well received there. So that's something we want to change, and that's what we're working for. And also, society benefits with the contribution of successful leaders or young leaders, which we strive for them to become change agents committed to their own communities also. So we are not just striving to change the lives of 1,500 students, but through them change the lives of many, many more. Thank you.